Welcome, everyone, to the EdgeVerse TechCast. This is your place for learning everything related to NXP software, tools, and enablement. If you're working with NXP processors and microcontrollers, well, you're in the right place. And I'm Kyle Dando. I'm one of your hosts.
And I'm Bridgette Stone, your other host. We're excited you're joining us because this episode is super special. It's the kickoff to our very first CRA week.
That's right. That means over the next 4 days, we're going to release 4 short episodes that build on each other, giving you a clear, structured understanding of the Cyber Resilience Act.
Each episode focuses on one major step of CRA compliance and answers the most common questions manufacturers are asking right now.
And Bridgette, based on the popularity of our other security episodes, this is exactly what our listeners have been asking for. So we're going to go deep.
Very deep tracks of you, Kyle.
Oh yes, just like those classic 12-inch LP albums. Okay, I think we may have lost some of our audience, but I think they get my dad joke.
And maybe one co-host. But anywho, to frame CRA week properly, we're bringing in the experts who work on this every day at NXP. Each episode will feature a member of our team who helps address CRA inquiries and guide internal development to meet hardware and software requirements.
So this isn't just theory. This is coming from the team that actually does the work.
And to kick off step 1, risk assessment, we're joined by Eve Atallah. Eve, welcome to CRA week.
Thank you, Bridgette and Kyle. Thank you for the invitation. I'm a security evaluation and certification expert of the Competence Center of Cryptography and Security team. And I'm actually currently heavily involved in standard development for the Cyber Resilience Act, in which the topic of risk assessment is absolutely fundamental.
Well, we're glad you're starting us off. No pressure, Eve. We'll just ask for you to define the entire foundation of CRA compliance.
Well, maybe to phrase that in a nicer way, let's clearly frame this for the listener. When a manufacturer says, okay, we need to comply with CRA, now what? What is the very first step?
Everything begins with 2 fundamental initial steps. First, you need to clearly identify the intended purpose of your product and the core functionality of your product fulfilling this purpose. And this will determine to which CRA category your product belongs to, which standard can be applied, and it also defines the possible conformity assessment procedure. Then a cybersecurity risk assessment needs to be done based on the intended purpose of the product. But be careful to take into consideration really the specific condition of use of your product, because this is not a risk assessment for a product category. This is really for your own specific product. This will determine which CRA essential cybersecurity requirements are applicable, and therefore which security measures the product must implement. So these 2 very first steps, the categorization and the risk assessment, will shape everything that follows in the CRA compliance process.
All right, well, that was perfect for step 1. What you basically said is that you need to get to know your product. You need to do that risk assessment. But now let's help our listeners associate this step with questions that they may be asking themselves and or looking for answers. So Eve, Bridgette and I are going to take turns asking you the most frequent questions that you told us customers have been asking. You are then going to share the advice that you've been already giving customers. So here we go. All right, the first question. What's the difference between risk assessment and threat analysis?
So I will start with a simplified answer, with a high-level description of each concept. The threat analysis determines which attacks are applicable to the product. It focuses on the attack techniques, attack vectors, attacker profiles, etc. So in essence, it provides a technical answer to the question, which attacks are possible on this product? The risk assessment identifies the risk, obviously, evaluate their level, and determine their acceptability. Now, what is a risk? This is typically defined by what should not happen, which is very important because not every disturbance of a product is a risk. The likelihood of its event happening, is there any chance that this risk will really ever happen, or will it remain completely theoretical? And finally, its impact, which can be regarding the business, the safety of users, the finance of the company, its reputation, etc. So the combination of likelihood and impact is the base for the determination of the risk acceptance, which is very important because this is the base for proportionality of risks, meaning it determines which reasonable and meaningful security measures are necessary.
Terrific, Eve. Okay, so now what about the second part of that question? Can you differentiate threat analysis versus risk assessment?
So maybe you can feel already the strong interdependence between the two. In fact, in practice, the threat analysis is part of the risk assessment process. Concretely, a threat is only meaningful if it leads to something harmful. But what is harmful needs to be determined. It requires identifying the assets and defining what is a successful attack against them at minimum, which is fully part of the risk assessment. And by the way, the threat analysis can be done outside of a risk assessment official process. However, it still relies on those inputs. And the less accurate and detailed are the inputs, the more high level the threat analysis will be.
Okay, so they're both dependent on each other. You have to make sure that your risk assessment includes all the threats, but then you need to go and see how much of a threat each of those is. Okay, who at the manufacturer typically performs this analysis and assessment?
Yeah, and your question also brings us to answer the question then why threat analysis and risk assessment are treated separately. This is because both requires different types of input and expertise. So usually different teams. Threat analysis in a company primarily relies on cybersecurity specialists, while the rest of the risk assessment depends mainly on other teams like business oriented or in charge of the strategy, the governance. So ideally, you also have a dedicated team or person that organize all that input from the different teams to consolidate the final risk assessment. So it really depends also on the structure of the company.
Okay, well, from your answer there, it sounds like there's different teams. So there's probably a lot of deliverables. Can you talk about what those teams typically produce? What is the result of their assessments?
At the end, all the analysis leads to a simple document like a spreadsheet with all the information about the asset, threats, impact, likelihood, risk level, expected mitigation, and so on. So these inputs gathered in this document at the end shall be sufficient to establish the list of applicable CRA cyber security essential requirements.
Really great detail on that question, Eve. Now on to the next common question. How do you respond when a manufacturer asks, how should I identify threats specific to my device?
So there is not one strict way of doing a threat analysis, but for sure it has to be based on really some fundamental inputs. So the assets and their security property, like the confidentiality, integrity, authenticity. Then on this base information, you can add additional ones which allow finer grained analysis of the threats and consequently to better determine most appropriate and efficient security measures. Those additional information can be first information on the operational environment of the product. This allows excluding attacks which cannot occur in the specific product environment. For instance, physical attacks may not make sense if the product is in a private home, where the product will not be physically accessible to attackers. Another useful information is the nature of the product itself, which hardware, which interfaces, features, protocols, etc. All that allow refining more and more the real threats on the particular product. Another important information to be considered is the attack potential the product is expected to resist against. So coming back to the question, what is important for the identification of the threats, for the threat analysis, are really those inputs. And the more accurate those inputs are, the more accurate will be the threats and the more efficient will be the countermeasures. While this may sound obvious, this can be trickier than expected. Like well determining the assets, for instance, could be challenging. And for companies that are not used to cybersecurity analysis, support may be required. It can be another experienced partner company, a security laboratory, or specialized consultants.
Or a really great podcast with some great guests. So, Eve, what you've just explained, it's very complicated. Companies need to take the due diligence to outline the threats and scenarios. It's great information for the customers to understand. So once they've gone through these first couple questions, probably the most common question that you said is, the CRA has product classifications. How do I determine the correct classification for my product? Is it a basic product? Is it an important? Or is it a critical product? Which class does my product fall into?
So first, something important to remind is that under CRA, products are not only devices or final products, but they are also component, hardware or software. And the CRA has established a list of product categories defined by what they call core functionality, like microcontroller, ASICs, OSs, browsers, firewalls, etc. So you can see that there are components in this list. So you first need to identify to which product category your product belongs to, and then all follows, because those product categories are grouped into higher level categories. Important products, the ones that you have just mentioned, and critical products. The important product category itself is split in two classes, class 1 and class 2, depending on the level of negative impacts. In summary, identifying the product category leads automatically to determine the classification. If your product does not correspond to any of the product category listed, then this is not called like this in the CRA text, but your product falls into the default category.
Okay, I remember this being introduced in our prior episode. It may be helpful for our listeners if you could associate some of those categories and classes with typical applications for products.
Sure. Some typical examples are for product in default category, industrial PLCs, smartphones. For important products, class 1, you have internet connected toys, personal wearables. For important product class 2, you can have hypervisors, firewalls, and microcontrollers. And for critical products, you have things like smart meters or banking cards, SIM cards.
Amazing, Eve. Thanks for adding these practical examples to share with our audience. And I think we have time for one more customer question. How do you choose the correct proof mechanism, meaning self-assessment versus third-party assessment?
In fact, you do not really choose, not fully freely at least. As just said, as soon as you have determined the product category, this automatically determines if the product is part of default, important class 1, important class 2, or critical. And each of these categories is associated with specific possible conformity assessment procedure. So if your product does not correspond to any of the product category listed and you are in default category, you can do pure self-assessment. If your product falls into the important class 1 category, a guided self-assessment is possible, meaning based on, let's say, a recognized standard. And if your product falls either in important class 2 or critical category, a third-party assessment is mandatory. And an important information here is that to support the assessment conformity to the CRA essential cybersecurity requirements, whether through self-assessment or third-party assessment, harmonized standards have been developed and they provide presumption of conformity. These harmonized standards specify in detail for each product category the security requirements to be implemented and how to assess their correct implementation. So this is a huge support for conformity assessment because it translates the CRA essential cybersecurity requirement into a set of technical measures that are automatically accepted once, of course, they are demonstrated to be properly implemented. And for information, those harmonized standards are still in development, but they should be released before the CRA entry into force in 2027.
Okay, well, Eve, this has been terrific. This has been a great first step in our CRA week. I'm going to do a quick recap to show you that I was listening and that you did such a great job of explaining this first step. You started off by saying that this is one of the most critical steps, because if you don't properly look at the risk assessment, then your threat analysis is incomplete. So it's really that first thing before you document something, before you search for that CE mark, before you do everything else, you need to understand the risk of your product as far as CRA is concerned. Then once you do that, Your threat analysis depends on the quality of your risk assessment. You're going to go in and see where that threat is actually applicable, make sure that you've fully understood what needs to be tested. Then you will come up with your product classification. Based on the threats and the risks that the product has, you mentioned, it's really going to determine itself. And once you have your product classifications, your conformity path, and the way you test and comply is really dependent on that class. You did a great job of outlining the self-reporting versus a third-party assessment. So great job answering those questions. I really think you've helped our customers understand this first step in their journey on the CRA compliance.
Yeah, Eve, thank you for kicking off CRA week with us. You made step one clear, practical, and approachable.
Thank you very much again for the invitation. It was very great to be there.
We will include links to recommended resources in the episode notes to help you go deeper on risk assessment. And tomorrow we move to step 2, security by design, where we take everything you've identified in step 1 and translate it into architecture decisions.
And hey, really quick, I want to make sure I mention this. For those listening before March 10th of 2026 this year, if you are attending the Embedded World in Nuremberg, Germany, one of my favorite places, be sure to attend NXP's CRA-focused speaker session. You'll be able to meet our experts live, and you can maybe ask them your own questions. But be sure to tell them that you heard them here first on CRA Week.
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next 3 episodes dropping this week. And if you have any questions about risk assessment or product classification, drop them in the comments. We're watching.
And until next time, keep researching the CRA, and we'll catch you on the next EdgeVerse TechCast, which will be tomorrow.